Ooh, I forgot to unmute myself. Alright. Yep, my bad. Thank you very much, Atlanta. I will start over actually, since I did not hit the record button, and I'm also recording for YouTube, so sorry about that. We'll start over, everyone. That was just a couple of pages. So, chapter 4. Can you guys hear me now on over there on the Twitch? Awesome, we're doing this. So chapter 4, a civil war in the north. On May 6, 2003, EVE Online officially launched to the public. Thousands of players from hundreds of corporations excitedly logged into the game for the first time and made their move. Everybody had their plan when the game first launched, how they become rich, how they become powerful. However, one of the greatest conquerors in New Eden's history chose to remain still. Evolution's original plan was to quietly take over New Eden. It set out to become the Illuminati of EVE Online. The plan was to maintain a low profile, creep into the midst of larger entities, and then use espionage to simply take over without anyone having noticed. But Evolution found that espionage is long, dreary work. It takes months to earn the trust of your superiors, and the only way to do that is by acting normal. So infiltrating a corporation has more to do with being a diligent miner and soldier than being a super spy assassin. Rather than trudge through that boring work just to maliciously deceive people, Evolution's leader opted to stay silent and observe. Evolution had enjoyed quite the reputation as an organization of elite players during the beta phase, and that extra attention made things more difficult for its leaders. So they chose to hit reset for a month and quietly build. The leadership was waiting to see what the optimal move would be, and so, for the first month EVE Online was live. Evolution stayed quiet, building ships and plotting its move. When it did make a move, it headed towards Fountain, a region of space in the west that wasn't controlled by a major alliance. There were a few corporations operating out of that territory, but none that individually posed a large threat to an organized force like Evolution. It's important to remember that the gaming world was much different in 2003 than it is in 2023. Today, voice communication and a strict chain of command are the default in EVE, but back then everything was much informal. Many corporations only used in-game text chat, which is much slower than being able to talk to your allies. It took a lot more effort and gumption to become a tight-knit group that could coordinate times to play together and talk on TeamSpeak or Ventrilo. Evolution was highly organized. It had its own forums and TeamSpeak server. This fact alone made it a formidable foe. Sir Molly said, "I believe the first official war we had was with some entity towards Fountain. We had like a 3-week war where we destroyed them, and they posted on the forums, okay, we're defeated." That was the kind of level you had in the wars back then. It was very isolated with 2 corporations. It was 30 people altogether. It was concentrated to 2 or 3 systems, and you actually had honorable wars, as in, I declare war on you. That changed over the years, he said again. The little wars and petty fights of the early days eventually gave way to Evolution's ambition, and it made its way toward Fountain. A brief war broke out once Evolution arrived in Fountain, as the locals, as Sir Molly diminutively called them, resisted Evolution's attempts to take over. The local corporations were successful at preventing their own eviction, and eventually a ceasefire was brokered which allowed Evolution to join as a member of the new Fountain Alliance. However, the newly unified Fountain Alliance wouldn't last long. Several Fountain Alliance leaders I spoke to described Fountain Alliance as a group that eventually became bogged down with bureaucracy. 5-hour weekly council meetings became the norm as they discussed logistics, territorial mining rights, and endless other laborious topics. Nobody was having fun, and Eve became work. A lack of fun is the silent killer of alliances in Eve. The boredom and bureaucracy of Fountain Alliance became too much for Evolution over time. In the matter of just a few months, Evolution left Fountain Alliance on amicable terms, said their farewells, and headed north. It wanted to fight a war, and it was prepared to manufacture one if it had to. Casus Belli. Meanwhile, in the north, the Venal Alliance had formed and was in the process of coalescing as a dominant force in the northern regions. The corporation of Venal Alliance worked together for mutual benefit and made a lot of money in the process. What the Venal Alliance didn't know was that one of its main corporation, Taggart Transdimensional, had a bullseye on its back. Taggart and Evolution had fought months earlier in the EVE Online beta, and now that Evolution had left Fountain Alliance in the west to search for a war in the nearby north, there was no better target than its old enemy. But Evolution couldn't just march in and declare war against an innocent alliance. That would paint it as the villain, which would harm its recruitment and potentially draw new allies to Taggart's aid. Evolution needed a proper reason to fight, so it set itself to trying to find one, whether it was valid or not. A player by the name of Mr. Blonde turned out to be adept at this type of spy work. The plan Mr. Blonde concocted was to send small raiding gangs into Venal Alliance territory and take cheap shots at Venal ships, the goal being to simply raise the blood pressure of the region. He wanted to make Venal afraid and get its leaders thinking about a fight. It didn't take the bait though, and Evolution was forced to play along. Text conversations still exist between the leaders of Evolution and Venal Alliance from this time, as Venal Alliance sought answers for why its allies were being targeted. In the logs, Evolution leader Sormoli feigns ignorance and claims the shootings were surely caused by a spat of new recruits who didn't understand Evolution's sterling code of conduct. Sormoli assured Venal Alliance leaders that he'd look into the problem and get back to them. He gave Venal's directors the runaround in every way short of asking them to submit a complaint to Evolution's Department of Personnel. Then he posted these conversations in Evolution's forums to have a laugh with his comrades. In a forum thread titled, "Who? Me? What? Why? Nah." Pretty good. Venal Alliance wasn't ready to go to war. It was wealthy enough that a few ship losses weren't very meaningful, especially when its leaders had been assured by their would-be enemies that these were isolated incidents that would be dealt with. So Evolution kicked things up a notch. Mr. Blonde, also known by the nom de guerre Femme Fatale, set to work concocting a new plan to paint Taggart Transdimensional as the secret aggressor in a new war. Planting evidence that Taggart Transdimensional was going behind Venal Alliance's back to hire mercenary pirates to attack Evolution's people. Independent sources are now stating that Mu, Sinister, and Roos received payment from Taggart Transdimensional for Evolution ship proven destroyed, Sormoli wrote in July 2003 on the public forums. Mu, Sinister, and Russ were well-known pirate factions of the day. Again, there are surviving conversation logs from this time showing Evolution players attempting to convince pirates from the accused faction to play along. In them, Sormoli sends a message to Stavros, then the leader of Mu, and smugly tells him he's going to give Stavros an opportunity. Sormoli requests that Stavros lie and say his alliance was paid to attack against Evolution. But Stavros informed him that he's mistaken and no such thing happened. Mole's reply, meh. He asked him to confirm it anyway. Ultimately, evolution never found someone to lie on its behalf. Sormoli still spread the lie anyway, but pretended he couldn't say where he got this information from out of a need to keep his sources confidential. Just days later, evolution determined that public sentiment, which it judged by conversation with allies and responses on the corporation, alliance, and organization discussion forums, was favorable enough for it to start an all-out war. Sormole's pilots were behind him, and the average player wasn't willing to rush to the aid of Taggart. Evolution was being given the benefit of the doubt. And so, still feigning shock, Evolution formally declared war against a confused Taggart transdimensional. Now this is in quote. "It's time. You have been tried and found guilty. The verdict is simple. Annihilation. Among the various accusations are these: paying known pirates ISK for hits on Evolution, supplying same pirates with ships and equipment, withholding information and blatantly lying. These accusations have been reviewed internally, and the answer is simple: Taggart Transdimensional will die. Sincerely, Sormoli, CEO, Evolution." Some people demanded proof of Evolution's allegation against Taggart Transdimensional, and Sormoli replied with such a transparent lie, it's a miracle it wasn't figured out. "Our statement is clear. We have no wish to try and convince anyone," Sormoli wrote on the forums. "This statement is good enough for us, and our sources are valid. That is all that matters. You may make up your own minds. That is not our decision. Our decision is made," he said. In other words, Sormoli said Evolution didn't care if the public approved of his cause for war or not, an obvious lie given that he was declaring the war and its causes on a public forum. You wanted the EVE-playing public to take Evolution at its word, even though it would take mere seconds to copy the supposed evidence into a forum post. 11 years later, Sormoli tells stories like this with a laugh. He's more than happy to admit his insatiable love of starting political fires, and he still clearly gets joy out of recounting the tales of his conquest over truth. Murder and butchery. With impending aggression right on their doorstep and Evolution banging its war drums, the leaders of Venal Alliance convened to determine their official response. The decision was unanimously made to stand by Taggart Transdimensional and wage war against the invading forces of Evolution. Evolution was not a large group at any standard. It had only a few dozen players, but it was spectacularly well organized. As much, Evolution was ready to go to war. Its pilots had outfitted themselves in some of the best ships available. They were ready and willing to show up for battles, and most importantly, they enjoyed warfare. Venal Alliance, by contrast, was a group that was largely set up for monetary gain. Even its best pilots tended to be former pirates who had more experience picking on defenseless miners than engaging in large fleet fights. Evolution came north from Fountain through pure, blind, and Tribute, and began its attack on Venal Alliance trade routes and mining spots. "The war began, and we got slaughtered," said Venal Alliance Jade Constantine in 2014. "Just outright murdered and butchery. We lost ship after ship after ship." Warfare in July 2003 was more informal, but also more hectic than in the modern game. There wasn't yet a system in EVE Online for defining which player groups owned which territory. It was very much a cultural thing. The players knew who owned which territory and didn't need official records. But this also meant that in Warzone there were no battle lines, and nothing to specifically be gained by short-term victories. With no official sovereignty to take from an enemy, that the main goal of a battle was simply to kill as many foes as possible and disrupt their operations. Evolution knew this very well, and it became equal part famous and reviled for its hit and fade attacks. An Evolution fleet would show up, inflict as much damage as it could, and then disappear before the enemy fleet had time to gather. Evolution's enemies mocked its perceived cowardice, and unwillingness to commit to a full fight. Evolution mocked them right back for expecting warfare to be conducted like Renaissance-era musketeers exchanging volleys in turn. A dance would occur between the two enemies that stretched around the clock, depending on where in the real world each fleet primarily hailed from. They would be dominant at different hours. When Evolution's commander didn't feel they could win a fight, they would leave. Occasionally, both would catch each other feeling confident and sparks would fly. The Bloody BKG. Few details remain of the battle from this time. What we do know is that the bulk of the fighting centered around the system BKG TAC Q2, in the heart of the Branch region, home to a valuable station that everyone wanted to control. The specifics of the individual battles were less important than the simple fact that Evolution was handing out a beating on the battlefield. Yet, Venal Alliance was winning on another front. Venal's figurehead leader, Jade Constantine, was hard at work waging a war of propaganda. From the very beginning, Venal Alliance's vision was that of a free North. Jade Constantine crusaded to keep the Northern Territories free from the type of corporate dictatorship that had sprung up all over the rest of New Eden. In those places, the law was simple. Anyone who isn't a stated ally was killed on sight. Even if they were neutral to you, kill them. The thinking was it wasn't worth the risk to have random people in your territory in case they're spies, saboteurs, or pirates. The dream of Venal Alliance was to create a territory where average players could come, do business, build ships, conduct commerce, and leave freely. It was a vision of a civilization that coexisted with the rest of New Eden rather than trying to militarily protect itself from all potential threats. We were running a PR campaign at a time that was saying essentially that Venal is a free port, said Jade Constantine in 2014. This is a place of free trading. It's somewhere anyone from Empire Space can come out to. So why not come out and fight for the Venal Alliance against the Evolution oppressors? You might be thinking that this sounds like a great deal more honorable than Evolution's deceptive warmongering. The citizens of New Eden at the time largely agreed, and Venal Alliance was becoming the martyr in the north. Jade Constantine is an extremely divisive force in the history of EVE Online, but an undeniably important one. At the time, many players hated seeing her face beside long propaganda screeds on the forum. Some saw her as pompous, self-righteous, and devious. They believed she twisted the facts to conform to her self-serving narrative. Jade carried herself with a pomposity that annoyed some, and she had a way of speaking down to dissenters, famously calling them "Medir." The real-life player behind Jade was exceptionally talented at painting a picture of warfare for the people of New Eden. Every week, players could find a 2,000-word essay he'd written attempting to control the conversation. When I interviewed Cruz, he told me about an old English king whom he'd taken inspiration from. The story of King Henry II of England in the 12th century, who was traveling through Britain, putting down rebellions in his various territory. At one point, he traveled to Ireland and put down a rebellion, only to be informed he'd have to go back to London to suppress an even larger one. The trouble was that his army had dwindled, and to make matters worse, he was forced to travel through potentially hostile territory, Wales. King Henry's astonishing solution was to pretend he was the reincarnation of legendary King Arthur. He hired seamstresses to create great white banners bearing Arthur's sigil, a red dragon. He hired minstrels and storytellers to travel ahead of his army to tell stories of how Arthur had been seen again after hundreds of years. According to the tale, he arrived at the shores of Wales that winter with basically nothing except his knight dressed in exceptionally flashy garb. For whatever reason, the people of Wales bought it. Not only did Henry II gain safe passage through the territory, but the Welsh people joined his army by the thousands. Cruz told me this story to illustrate a point about shaping a conflict through words, and how a story alone can change the course of history. Jade Constantine the Verbose. As a result of Jade Constantine's propaganda public relations campaign, Venal Alliance started attracting numerous new corporations from Empire space who wanted to try their hand at warfare in Nullsec. Some people loathed Jade, but others believed in their visions of a Freeport in the north. Venal Alliance had the financial backbone, and these new recruits provided the manpower the Alliance needed to keep the defense strong at all hours of the day. So Venal began buying dozens of smaller ships for its newfound meat shield. The combination of an effective narrative, a bevy of new volunteers, and a strong financial backbone allowed it to stabilize as sufficient defenders of the North. Unfortunately, defense was all its pilots could manage. It could stand its ground against evolution, but Venal Alliance was far from winning the war. Its miners were safe enough to keep mining, and their merchant ships stayed safe, but the battles weren't being won. They just weren't catastrophic defeats anymore. It wasn't long before the members of Venal Alliance started to notice that the members of Taggart Transdimensional, the people Venal Alliance banded together to defend from evolution, were barely ever seen anymore. Battles would break out and Taggart members weren't fighting them. Taggart was an exceptionally wealthy corporation, with a population of players that made up roughly 40% of the Venal Alliance. In battles, however, it represented far less than that. Jade Constantine and others called for another gathering of Venal Alliance War Council to discuss how to deal with this. Taggart heard their arguments and offered to help out its allies in the Venal Alliance by selling them battleship at only a 20% markup from the cost Taggart incurred in building them, which it tried to justify was 15% less than it usually marked them up. I like to compare this situation to a person asking their friends to help them to move the house, except when the friends arrive to help, the homeowner doesn't move any boxes. When the friends inevitably complain, the homeowner feigns sympathy and tries to make amends by offering to sell them a hand truck. It was a deal that was obviously rejected and was borderline insulting. Around this time, Sir Molly of Evolution reached out to contact Jade Constantine for a parley. He spoke to Jade with his trademark patronizing tone, telling her that Evolution had been impressed by the fighting spirit of the Venal Alliance. However, what Evolution wanted was to hurt Taggart Transdimensional, and Sir Molly was frustrated that Taggart was so often missing from the battlefield. So, Sir Molly offered his deal. Throw Taggart Transdimensional out of the Venal Alliance, and Evolution would recognize Venal Alliance's sovereignty in the north and call a ceasefire with everyone but Taggart. And this led to this treacherous night. Jade took the deal back to Venal and called a meeting of what was known as the Council of the Free Captains. It was a dramatic midnight meeting where delegates from all factions within Venal Alliance got together to cast their votes. Jade had gone to the leader of Taggart, a player named Ragnar, to discuss the meeting beforehand. She told him that she and her corporation, Jericho Fraction, were prepared to stick by Taggart if it started pulling its weight. Her proposal was to alter the Venal Alliance tax system, which at the time mandated that each member corporation contribute 25 million ISK per week to the Alliance to cover ship replacement and ammunition. Taggart was a very large corporation of over 200 people, several times larger than other Venal Alliance corporation, but it still only had to pay 25 million per week. Jade wanted to bring that up to an amount proportional to the massive size of the corporation. This was a philosophical problem for Taggart. Its leaders were stalwart believers in Ayn Rand's objectivist philosophy, both in Eve and in their ordinary lives. The name Taggart itself comes from Ron's book, Atlas Shrugged, which starts protagonist Dagny Taggart as a vice president of a railroad company called Taggart Transcontinental. Ragnar himself is also named after a character from Atlas Shrugged, so this idea of having to pay a heavy tax to a government that would seek to control their action was fairly horrifying for the members of Taggart. They refused Jade Constantine's deal. Sensing that there was a very real chance Taggart could be abandoned by its allies, Ragnar moved to consolidate power. He privately consulted with the member corporation of Venal Alliance and lobbied them to side with him. There is a rift coming, and there is one side that is safe and one that is not, Ragnar told one such corporation. The day of the vote arrived. The ballots were cast and counted. 6 votes in favor of preserving the Union, 5 votes against. Taggart managed to survive and the Venal Alliance was preserved. Evolution heard every word of the meeting. It had a spy. Again, Mr. Blonde. In Venal Alliance midst, he was relaying the minutes. To put it mildly, Evolution was disappointed. Venal Alliance banding together could have spelled the death of its campaign. If Evolution couldn't break Venal in the previous months, there was no reason to believe it would happen now, especially with all the Venal's foreign volunteers still flooding in from Empire space. But just as the Venal Alliance Council meeting moved on to other matters, a spokesman of Ragnar interrupted to deliver a prepared statement. Taggart Transdimensional does not recognize the authority of this council, nor the voting power of a corporation 1/100th of our size having the same power to limit our sovereignty. It is clear that the anti-Taggart effort has been led by Jade Constantine, who has been bought by Evolution. We'll start with 100 million bounty on Jade Constantine. Taggart and our friends will remain in Venal, and we will openly attack all of the pro-Evolution people that have just voted against their one-time friend in Taggart. This is fair warning. Thank you. Ragnar, CEO from Taggart. The Venal Alliance Council was stunned. In the view of these council members, this vote was just a natural process of inter-alliance diplomacy. At first, it wasn't clear Ragnar actually understood what had happened. Maybe he misheard the vote count and thought that Taggart was being evicted. No such luck. The nightmare was real. Taggart had declared war on its former allies. Almost instantly, Venal shut down. This was no longer anybody's home. This was unfriendly territory for any soul who went too far north. Jade Constantine commemorated the occasion with yet another epic overwrought forum post. I, Jade Constantine, take up the mantle of Ragnar's 100 million isk of blood money and wear it proudly as a shroud to brittle avarice and all the works of foolish craven traitor lord below. Death to Taggart, death to Ragnar, death to the memory of this treacherous night. Jade Constantine, CEO of Jericho Fraction Venal Alliance. Battle lines. The Venal Alliance immediately demanded a revolt in light of Taggart's war declaration against its own allies. It should go without saying that this changed the minds of a number of swing votes. The original vote was 6-5 in favor of Taggart, but a new vote was 9-2 against Taggart, not counting Taggart's vote. It was partially meaningless given that Taggart had made no qualms about burning the Alliance to the ground, but this was a moment for the other Venal Alliance Corporation to reform and to clarify that their dedication was to Venal Alliance, not Taggart. Venal Alliance, as it once existed, was now dead. The 9 remaining members reformed and began calling themselves the New Venal Alliance, shifting their focus to destroying Taggart. This was more difficult than it sounds, however. Taggart was still staggeringly wealthy and well-equipped. One of the first issues that divided the former Venal Alliance was that Taggart wasn't showing up for battles. Sir Moldy himself was upset that Taggart wasn't hurting enough. The members of the new Venal Alliance had just ended a large, highly destructive war against evolution, and were now expected to fight a war against Taggart, which had barely taken any damage in that war. Taggart was fresh and flush with equipment for fighting a long war. But Taggart Transdimensional was not a fighting corporation, though. Its pilots liked to mine and make money. They were exceptionally good at it. Taggart preferred to stick to its own niche while fighting its wars through proxies and mercenaries. It had all the resources needed to fight a war without the will necessary to see it through personally. Taggart got together with the two other former Venal Alliance members who had voted to stand by it, and the new group began calling itself the Northern Alliance. It attracted one more new member, the well-known pirate group N3G4. Taggart was now at the head of an alliance that featured three of the most feared pirate faction in the north of New Eden. It claimed Venal for its own uses and warned all others to evacuate. However, Taggart had drastically underestimated the disastrous result of spurning its former allies when those allies were voted democratically to stand by Taggart. It left an alliance of borderline hippies trying to keep the North free and open in favor of an alliance filled with hated pirates. The new Venal Alliance propaganda machine used this to its advantage. It was effective at painting Taggart in a horrible light. Jade Constantine kept up her verbal attacks, rebranding Taggart Transdimensional as Taggart Transpiratical. Over the next few weeks, the new Venal Alliance started receiving care packages from all over New Eden. People were sending ships and money and morale-boosting well-wishes, inspiring the new Venal Alliance to keep up the fight and wipe out the enemies Jade had painted as hypocritical capitalist snakes. More foreign volunteers continued to come up north to fight with the new Venal Alliance. Venal Alliance had been through hell for the last 2 months, but its leaders understood better than anyone in New Eden how to make a war fun. It was managing to win wars while it was actually losing on the battlefield, because it understood that EVE players need to have a goal to stay entertained. Venal Alliance gave its members a goal using ideology and attracted other players from around New Eden Star Cluster because it offered these people something to believe in, a real reason to be playing this video game. This alone would have been bad news for Taggart, brand new Northern Alliance, but something else happened that Ragnar didn't expect. Evolution was true to its word. Evolution held up its end of the ceasefire bargain and stopped fighting the new Venal Alliance. Beyond that, Evolution went so far as to actually aid the new Venal Alliance in its oncoming civil war. Evolution supplied it with ships, minerals, manpower, essentially making the new Venal Alliance into Evolution's proxy for destroying its sworn enemies, Taggart Transdimensional and its gang of pirates. The new Venal Alliance knew, however, that it wasn't going to beat Taggart through force of arms. Taggart was simply too wealthy and could replace ships too easily. So Venal started training its new allies in unconventional tactics in order to disrupt Taggart's income. One new corporation called Reikoku stood out from the crowd. Its pilots were new to EVE, and Jade Constantine had recruited it as a mercenary unit and schooled its pilots in the dark art of suicide ganking. The basic idea behind a suicide gang is to equip a cheap ship with 100% of the ship's energy focused on burst firepower, with no concern for survivability, to almost instantly kill your enemy. This way you can attack them right in front of EVE's online NPC police force in the high security Empire space and still be able to secure the kill. The attacking ship will also be destroyed, but it's cheaper, easier to replace, and not filled with valuable mining cargo. We basically funded a suicide ganking campaign against Taggart miners in Northern Lone Trek, said Jade, which was the other front of the war. To be quite honest, Reikoku did more to crush Taggart than anybody else because they were absolutely lunatic about suicide attacks. This went on for 2 weeks. The new Venal alliance fought a series of battles in Venal itself, while Reikoku hammered the Tagart supply lines and trade routes through Lone Trek. Only 15 days after this fighting officially began, a delegate from Tagart appeared in the EVE Online forums. Earlier today, Ragnar Daneskold officially stepped down as president and CEO of Tagart Transdimensional and declared his retirement from EVE. We wish to put the controversy of recent times behind us, and as such are wiping the slate clean. Our kill on sight list is empty, and we are declaring a unilateral ceasefire effective immediately. All bounties have been revoked, and all existing alliances have been dissolved. In particular, while Tagart Transdimensional has never condoned piracy, we have in the past been member of alliances which have included Pirate Corporation. This is no longer the case, nor will it ever be in the future. We look forward to reaffirming our diplomatic and trade relation with all other corporations and alliances, and working toward a secure and prosperous future for all. Gunny P, new CEO. That was in October 2nd, 2003. Though Tagart tried as hard as possible to hide it, this was a surrender. Tagart's figurehead leader Ragnar had left the game suddenly and without explanation, and leadership fell to people who no longer believed in this war. They wanted to go back to being a simple ISK-making operation. Tagart left the north and tried to get back to the peace that used to be considered normal. Almost every other corporation involved in the fighting agreed to the ceasefire eagerly. Sormoli was still skeptical and didn't seem happy to stop killing Tagart's ship, but he went along with it. Tagart had been wounded badly through all of this. Its membership had dropped catastrophically. Can't pronounce that. And it had grown to depend more and more of mercenaries. Then the player named Anla Shock broke its back. A former director of Tagart Transdimensional, Anla Shock, recognized the corporation's weakness for the opportunity it was and executed the largest corporate theft in the first year of EVE. The still vast coffers of Tagart Transdimensional filled to the brim when the ultra-wealthy Ragnar left his fortune were looted. In total, 1.2 billion ISK was stolen from the shared corporate account all of the directors used to pool their funds in. An incredible amount of money from that era that would have paid for hundreds, if not thousands of ships. And Lashak then took the ill-gotten gains and joined Evolution. This is so good. Tagart Transdimensional would never again be a force in New Eden, but the story of the new Venal Alliance was only just getting started. Chapter 5, A Prelude to War. Let me take a sip here. With Tagart kicked out of the north at the end of the Venal Civil War, control of the northern territories was taken by the new Venal Alliance. Evolution was satisfied with its victory over Tagart, and the fighting was over. The new Venal Alliance had grown large in the meantime, with the addition of powerful new member corporation Oberon, Cyberdyne, and Terra Nova. The new Venal Alliance was looking forward using this peacetime to rebuild, but the drama wouldn't end. Egos and ideologies clashed. Throughout the war, Jade Constantine had been fighting to create a free space in the north, somewhere average pilots from all over New Eden could come to explore or conduct commerce. Even when most people found that Jade Constantine overzealous and even obnoxious, she was still adept at shaping the message of any given situation. She relentlessly spread her propaganda on the political forums, and while many saw her as manipulative, others were beginning to see her as benevolent. Several of the newer members of the New Venal Alliance didn't agree with Jade's philosophy, particularly her main political rival within the alliance, Alseth Dern, CEO of Oberon. Dern couldn't understand why they should cede control and share the spoils of war after they just fought to maintain control of this territory. The crux of their differences came down to the fact that these new members of the New Venal Alliance were largely mining corporations. And mining corporations by nature tend to hate the idea of free space. They like to trot out massive mining ships and essentially just set them to auto-mine while the players themselves chatted or watched television outside the game. Miners could make a great deal of ISK that way, but if there were strangers nearby, they would have to remain vigilant or risk being shot down. The ideological clashes between Jade and the rest of the Alliance carried on for weeks, and only their collective wariness with warfare kept the Alliance together. But soon, war would come to the north, whether the New Venal Alliance wanted it or not. Public dissension in the New Venal Alliance attracted an all-out pirate invasion, and the Alliance was shocked when one of their pirate corporation, Terra Nova, betrayed them and joined the pirates in the middle of a pitched battle. The rest of the squabbling New Venal Alliance was united by the betrayal. They managed to fight back the pirate threats, but the traitors made the leaders of the Alliance highly sensitive to more internal threats. The mining groups within the New Venal Alliance, such as Oberon and Cyberdyne, used the invasion to show that the borders should be closed to prevent any further attacks. Some of them still blame Jade Public's bluster for attracting the pirates in the first place. The division was deepening. The other main corporation within the New Venal Alliance were growing suspicious of the close bond between Reikoku and Jericho Fraction. Reikoku had proven himself to be a powerful military force in the war against Taggart. It had even begun taking breaks from defending Venal to accept mercenary contracts. The largest corporation in the New Venal Alliance, Oberon, Rona, and Cyberdyne, were well aware of Jade's ambition to open the North as a free port, and their leaders grew concerned about the possibility of a Jade Constantine-led coup with Reikoku's CEO Galavet at her side. In Alseth Dern's view, in order to prevent Jade from radicalizing other members, steps needed to be taken. Jade was issued a gag order by the Alliance's council. She was removed from her role as the spokesperson for the New Venal Alliance, and forbidden from speaking publicly on behalf of the Alliance. It was a devastating loss for her, but people from both sides of the New Venal Alliance said she graciously accepted this action as a way to heal the divides in the New Venal Alliance. Here's what she said. Effective immediately, I wish to announce my formal resignation from the post of Public Relations Representative for the New Venal Alliance, NVA. Of the reasons for my resignation, I will say only this, that it had become clear that my many enemies and stalkers in the sphere of public debate were making practical dissemination of useful information near impossible. Such indeed is the hatred of my face and voice in some quarters that any words I spoke were immediately drowned out by raucous cries of brute antithesis. I wish all the best, of course, to the New Venal Alliance and the corps so joined in glorious camaraderie against the encroaching darkness. It is meet and fitting both that such a bold company of heroes should survive the birthing hands of its founders. How else that the dream of freedom, wrought in blood and sacrifice, be passed from past to future, and the promise of brighter times to come. So I say, long live the NVA, for now my work is done. Jade, CEO of Jericho Fraction. That was in November 29, 2003. Then something very strange happened. Alset Dern put a deal on the table to form a non-aggression pact with the pirate faction that had just invaded. In EVE terminology, a non-aggression pact was considered very close to a true alliance. He was suggesting they work together with the very same group that had just invaded their territory and whose members included the Terra Nova traders. Jericho Fraction and Reikoku went ballistic. They had fought the pirate threat on the front lines, and now they were being asked to take a step back while their leaders befriended those same invaders. A huge argument unfurled as Jade Constantine and Galavet accused Alseth of ignoring their sacrifices in fighting the pirate threats. Meanwhile, anger flowed the other way as the rest of the New Venal Alliance accused Jade Constantine of being the catalyst for that war in the first place. Alset wrote, "I have gotten to know her these last few months. She's a liar, a manipulator, and her only weapon is this forum. She lives for it. If you believe half of anything she ever says, you are a sucker. Being this way, she must always have a target for her only weapon. She has now chosen me to be her new Ragnar. And every one of you who read what she says believes it, and then regurgitates it as divine scripture. You are a gullible fool." The cracks of the New Venal Alliance had become a chasm. Jade and her corporation as a whole were removed from the New Venal Alliance. Reikoku quit as well in a show of solidarity. Jade and her followers retreated to Empire Space to brood. Galavet led Reikoku to a profitable line of work as full-time mercenaries. After nearly a year of conflict, civil war, and infighting, there was relative peace in the north. With Jade Constantine now out of the picture, the New Venal Alliance was ruled by three corporations: Oberon, Cyberdine, and Rona. Along with their many subsidiaries, they formed the main power block in the northern regions. The Phoenix Alliance rises. The new lords in the north wanted to symbolically move away from the warfare and drama that had plagued their first year of existence. They wanted to make their own society in space and get away from the reputation, good or bad, that Jade Constantine had given the North. They decided to reform the Alliance and abandon the New Venal Alliance name. The change meant nothing structurally, but everything symbolically. What's more, CCP Game was about to introduce a new system into EVE Online that would officially recognize alliances. Previously, alliances were spoken agreements or treaties between corporations. Now they would be hardwired into the game mechanics, allowing alliances to structure themselves more efficiently. The remaining leaders of the former New Venal Alliance gathered together to cement an official alliance. They declared that they would be the Phoenix Alliance, rising from the ashes of their scarred past toward a more glorious future. And they declared their reformation on the CAOD forums. This communique is also a declaration of our organization's birth and intention, wrote the Phoenix Alliance public relation writer, Iraqi Phoenix. We formed from what once were the core corporation of the New Venal Alliance. Let it be known that we freely left that organization to be born again under the common interest of prosperity and mutual protection. From this point on, the past remains in the past. References to civil wars, victories or defeats, betrayals, heroics, and feuds associated with past alliance of the Northern Territories are now abolished to material we consider irrelevant. The Phoenix Alliance will now start with a clean slate and a determined focus on what is best for the corps of the Phoenix Alliance. Alset Dern was voted the leader of the Phoenix Alliance. Despite my best effort, I was never able to contact Alset Dern during my research for this book. By all indication, both his allies and his enemies, Alseth was a strong and formidable leader who had the charisma to command the respect of thousands of people. He was unquestioned in his leadership, even by CEOs within the alliance who themselves led hundreds of people. But there was one group within Phoenix Alliance that Alseth Dern could not control. Despite his best effort, Cyberdyne Industries was a borderline renegade faction within Phoenix Alliance. Cyberdyne members were jokers and pranksters who had no respect for authority. Its pilots did what they wanted, and sometimes that meant angering their own allies. But no matter how badly Cyberdyne angered its Phoenix Alliance leaders, it was always able to patch things over quickly, because its membership was renowned as a bunch of lovable, fun-loving jokers who were difficult to stay mad at. The other alliances in the north didn't always feel the same way. There was a growing power in the north, however, and it needed to be reckoned with. A group called Forsaken Empire had rallied the many pirate factions of the northeast into a powerful pirate alliance. Together, under the banner of Forsaken Empire, they were intent on spreading their influence throughout the northern region. At the height of its power, Forsaken Empire controlled one of the largest stretches of star system in the game. While the many wars of the Venal Alliance, New Venal Alliance, and now Phoenix Alliance were being fought further north, Forsaken Empire gathered power in the northeast. By late 2003, it was undisputed in its control of Germinate and Vale of the Silent, and was the main power in the disputed territories of Tribute, Declane, and Fade. Reikoku comes home. Reikoku eventually returned from its mercenary endeavor back to the north, where it still had friends from its days fighting Tagart. Reikoku returned because on December 18, 2003, CCP Game had just released EVE Online's first free expansion pack, which included a major new feature that was highly attractive to nullsec space holders. Now, in nullsec, players' groups would be able to officially take ownership of a station. In the past, the only way to control the station was by maintaining military control over the space around it at all times. This new update meant that players could lock out enemies and control the territory even in time zones when they weren't military dominant. They could make a home. It was still possible to conquer station, but it took much more concerted effort. Galavit sold the rest of Reikoku on the idea of moving back north to settle down, and Reikoku set a course for the Declane region. Far in the northwest, this was still Wild West territory. It was far enough away from the major commerce systems that nobody had bothered to conquer it. It was one of the few places left where a relatively small group of players could own space that wasn't controlled by the larger alliances, and the only people out there were a small corporation of a few dozen people. Reikoku wasn't the only group drawn to Declane. Declane was at the outer reaches of the territory controlled by Forsaken Empire, and the Empire was keen to expand its turf. It had recently moved into Declane and taken stations away from a group in the region, that none of the small corporations of Declane were safe. Seeing no other option, the settlers of the desolate Declane region, including Reikoku, banded together to preemptively strike Forsaken Empire. They called themselves the Coalition of Declane. Meant people in those days, right, with those names. Very inspired. Forsaken Empire controlled its vast territory through vassals, which kept control of the Empire's behalf, and paid taxes to the larger organization. The Coalition of Declane knew that Forsaken Empire was too small to control its many territories directly, so instead of attacking the Empire head-on, it decided to strike the vassals and weaken Forsaken Empire's grip on the region, starting with Fade. Fade is not particularly valuable territory, and this might explain why it was often filled with weak, vulnerable alliance. The relative weakness of its early inhabitant and its crucial position in the center of the Northwest turned the Fade region into a frequent battleground in this era. Reikoku struck first in Fade at a group called the Rising Storm, making daily incursions into its territory designed not just to blow up its pilot ships, but to disrupt their way of life. In striking the Rising Storm alliance, the Coalition of Decline hoped to damage Forsaken Empire's finances as well. Using guerrilla-style hit-and-run tactics, it quickly racked up an impressive list of kills. Finally, its fleets caused enough damage to get the attention of the main forces of Forsaken Empire, which set a course for Fade. To prepare for a head-to-head fleet battle with Forsaken Empire, Reikoku and the Coalition of Decline called up their allies, the owners of other nearby regions, who were worried about Forsaken Empire's expansionist tendencies. And the Fade Union turns. The day of the battle came, and when Forsaken Empire arrived in Fade, it was met head-on by the Coalition of Declane's fleet. But its own admission, the Coalition of Decline was overwhelmed by superior tactics and numbers. After a brief skirmish, the Coalition fleet retreated, but next weekend it was back, and so was the Forsaken Empire fleet. The Coalition moved into the capital system of Fade, C4C, but was outmaneuvered by the Forsaken Empire, which trapped and blockaded it into the system. Forsaken Empire locked down both of the stargates that led into the system and refused to let the Coalition of Declined fleet escape. The Coalition put out a call for help and was answered by nearby allies NORAD and Black Nova Corporation, who sent a fleet to their aid. The ships from these allies engaged the Forsaken Empire blockade in a coordinated attack with the Coalition of Declined ships. The blockade collapsed and a large fleet battle ensued deep in the heart of Fade. Hundreds of ships clashed in one of the biggest battles in the early history of EVE. From a distance, the battle would have looked like a giant ball of ships with laser fire crisscrossing the diameter. 100 beams of lasers light would erupt from each fleet ships and converge on whichever enemy the fleet commander had chosen to be destroyed first. From inside the fight, the tangle of laser beams, missiles, and ship explosion would have been completely indecipherable. The sky in front of each player's ship was a torrent of destruction. Of course, the average player didn't see that. To the actual pilots, the battle was a laggy mess. They would zoom their view out as far as possible until all they saw were little blips on their screen. Blue for allied ships, red for enemies. Each side's fleet commander would do their best to make a good strategic decision despite the fact it could take entire minutes for the lag to clear up and show a current view of the battlefield. As a combat-oriented alliance, Forsaken Empire was used to these kind of conditions, much more so than the average Coalition of Decline members. Even with its new allies, the Coalition of Decline couldn't stand its ground against Forsaken Empire and was forced to retreat again. But it kept coming back, weekend after weekend. Coalition of Decline pilots would return to Fade and fight Forsaken Empire, and weekend after weekend the Coalition of Decline was pushed back. On the 5th weekend of continuous attacks, the two sides clashed again. Forsaken Empire's fleet commanders grew confident when they saw that Reikoku was absent from the fight, and assumed it finally scared him off. Unbeknownst to those commanders, Reikoku wasn't in the main battle because it was busy intercepting Forsaken Empire's reinforcements 2 systems away. The main battle erupted in C4C, and Forsaken Empire fleet commanders kept calling for reinforcements, but they've never made it to the front line. Reikoku's raiding squads were destroying them before they got into the battle. After dispatching a number of small reinforcement fleets, Reikoku set course to rendezvous with the fleet in C4C. With the fresh forces of Reikoku now joining the fray, the morale of the coalition turned. It had managed to hold its own for an hour in this battle against Forsaken Empire, and now one of its main military allies was joining the fight virtually unharmed. Dozens of Rikoku ships entered a simmering ball of laser fire and explosions, and Forsaken Empire ships began popping one by one as streams of lasers converged on their most valuable ships. With no reinforcements, Forsaken Empire was forced on the field of battle for the first time. This changed the tone of the war considerably. A meeting was set between the Allied Coalition and Forsaken Empire's vassal and Fade, the Rising Storm Alliance. As the RSA asked for clemency, the RSA couldn't keep up this level of warfare. The Coalition of the Clane agreed to stop attacking them, but under strict terms. Change your name forever and stop attacking them, and assist the Coalition with evicting Forsaken Empire from the surrounding territories. In other words, Rising Storm couldn't just surrender. It had to renounce everything and turn its coat on its former masters. In a testament to how rough the conflict had been on Rising Storm, its leaders agreed unanimously to these audacious terms. Rising Storm Alliance changed its name to Fade Union and set its sights on aiding the eviction of Forsaken Empire from neighboring tribute. The mighty killer of the Forsaken Empire. A grand coalition of allies was now arrayed against Forsaken Empire. The hurt but not broken Fade Union joined the coalition of the Clane and its allies on a quest to run Forsaken Empire out of Tribute, out of Vale, and out of Geminate, and out of Nullsec entirely. These alliances spent weeks on logistics, moving their backup ships into position, stocking up on ammunition, and creating a battle plan. And the time came. The allies gathered and flew into Tribute, ready for battle. But there was nobody there. Well, not nobody. There were miners working in the region and a few stray Forsaken Empire pilots, but nothing remotely ready to challenge the Coalition fleet. As it turns out, Forsaken Empire had been struggling with a problem that was dwindling its forces and diminishing its ability to defend its outlying territories. The problem was Lineage 2. With so many enemies, including its former allies, the Fade Union, knocking out on Tribute's door, a great many Forsaken Empire pilots had decided their defense of Tribute was hopeless, and they decided instead to spend more time with the cutting-edge new fantasy MMO, Lineage 2. Knowing that its grip on Tribute was fading, Forsaken Empire called in its allies to help. Its friends in the south, Curse Alliance, sent along a large fleet of about 50 ships to aid in the defense of Forsaken Empire's territory. Combined with its own weakened fleet, Forsaken Empire had approximately 75 ships ready to retake Tribute. At the time, a measly 8 Rikoku pilots were stationed in the main hub of Tribute. When Forsaken Empire began their attack, the 8 Rikoku pilots called for backup, and with incredible speed were able to raise 20 battleships from the Coalition of the Clane, 20 battleships from Fate of Union, and an additional 8 Rikoku ships for the defense. Outnumbered 75 to 56, Rikoku and its allies still handily won the ensuing battle. Rikoku and its allies were all equipped in high-end battleships, while their Curse Alliance Forsaken Empire enemy flew a mixture of frigates, cruisers, and battleships. As the battle was nearly over, even more reinforcements showed up and broke the back of Forsaken's Empire forces, decisively ending their attempt to retake Tribute. The dream of Alset Dern. Forsaken Empire was gone from Tribute, and the Allies soon pushed it out of Vale. However, none of the alliances involved in ousting them were interested in controlling that extra territory. They were mostly striking against Forsaken Empire as a preemptive measure to protect themselves from its expansionist ambitions in Fade and the Clane. A power vacuum developed in Tribute, and this invited pirates to take free reign over a northern territory. Recognizing this threat, the disparate powers of the north Phoenix Alliance, Fade Union, Coalition of Declain, and NORAD, decided it was in their mutual interest to lock down Tribute, to prevent it from turning into a pirate state that would serve as a staging ground for incursions into their territories. They formed a treaty called NAST, the Northern Alliance's Security Treaty, which turned Tribute into a protectorate between the four of them. There was no central government over Tribute, and any minor... Yeah, right? Like, my cat is very talkative. The Alliance... Sorry. They formed... Blah, blah. There was no central government over Tribute, and any miner or trader could come and go freely. The alliances would sponsor military patrols which would shut down any and all pirate activity. Ironically, it was an arrangement that Jade Constantine might have supported a few months earlier. Everyone was happy with this, except Reikoku. From its point of view, Phoenix Alliance had waltzed in, patted everyone on the back for their bravery in ousting Forsaken Empire, and then decided everyone in the north should share the territory equally, regardless of how large a role they played in the battle. Reikoku's pilots balked at sharing their victory with a group that had done none of the work to achieve it. Then Alcet Dern went one step further. He wanted to unite the alliances of the North in a grand, peaceful coalition, and to that end he made a non-aggression pact with Forsaken Empire. Dern had failed to recognize that the diplomatic victory of signing a non-aggression pact with Forsaken Empire would weaken Phoenix Alliance's relationships with all of its neighbors, who still loathed Forsaken Empire. Phoenix Alliance had just made peace with the blood rivals of Reikoku and Coalition of Declain. Suddenly, the whole of the North was casting a skeptical eye at one another. At this point in the history, things get momentarily fuzzy. Every group involved at the time had its own story for what happened next. The one thing that I'm certain of is that the northern powers of New Eden, Phoenix Alliance, Fade Union, Coalition of Declain, NORAD, and Little Reikoku suffered a communication breakdown. In this era of Eve, communication was not as simple as it is now. Enemies in Eve rarely talked outside of hurling accusation at one another on the forums. Things started to get very tangled and confusing in the North, and people were not communicating well enough to sort them out. The main problem centered around Phoenix Alliance's rogue faction, Cyberdyne. Practically every day, Reikoku complained that Cyberdyne had blown up one of its mining ships or harassed its players. It was hard to prove their accusation. In this era of Eve, there was no official documentation to confirm the details of an attack. In modern Eve, a kill mail, a log of the details of a battle, is sent to involve players after every ship's destruction. But in this era of Eve, that system hadn't been implemented yet. The two main leaders of the Phoenix Alliance, Alcet Dern and Roby 1, were stuck in the middle trying to keep the two from killing one another. Cyberdyne and its leader Kruls insisted Reikoku's accusations were unfounded, but Reikoku wouldn't relent. In an attempt to keep the peace, Phoenix Alliance finally agreed to sanction Cyberdyne Industries. Phoenix Alliance's promise to deal with Cyberdyne wasn't good enough for Reikoku though, and it drew a line in the sand. Reikoku shut down the mutually controlled Protectorate of Tribute and took command of the region. As its first moves as the stated owners of Tribute, Reikoku offered free access to the territory to every northern power except Phoenix Alliance. Here's what they said. Many people have voiced an opinion on what should become of the Tribute and Vale region of Eve. For over a month, Reikoku has been working against the forces of the South Forsaken Empire and its overexpanding grasp to reclaim these lost areas. Help has come from a few close friends, but others valued a non-aggressive pact with an enemy more than a call for help from an old friend. I personally let this travesty pass for too long, and now it has reached a critical point within the ranks of my corporation. So as of now, until somebody can take it from us, tribute is closed space. Far too long has Reikoku bled for the security of others with nothing in return. No longer will this be the case. Galavet, CEO of Reikoku. On May 27, 2004, Reikoku alleged that Cyberdyne Industries pilots had once again entered Reikoku territory and shut down a mining ship. Cyberdyne vehemently denied the accusations. This time, however, Cyberdyne knew the allegations were true, and so did Alset Dern, who, according to senior Phoenix Alliance members, work with them to cover it up and keep the peace. Seemingly, the only person who didn't know the truth was Phoenix Alliance's other main leader, Obi-Wan of Ronacorp. Furious that Phoenix Alliance had once again refused to punish Cyberdyne, Reikoku gave up all hope of a peaceful solution. It prepared its military assets for war and began to approach potential allies for support. In the oncoming fight, Fade Union, Coalition of Decline, Evolution, Jericho Fraction, NORAD, and even Evolution, which was mentioned twice here. On May 28, 2004, while Phoenix Alliance was still trying to cover up the latest Cyberdyne infraction, a small fleet of Reikoku ships entered Phoenix Alliance space in Vino and began an all-out attack. That was the opening shot. Reikoku found and destroyed a Phoenix Alliance battleship, catching it completely off guard. Obi-Wan recalled having 34 conversation windows open up on the screen within 5 minutes of the attack. Phoenix Alliance pilots were desperately looking for an official order from senior leadership about how to deal with Reikoku's surprise attack. They finally found their footing, organized the fleet, and pushed Reikoku out. In the face of the largest Phoenix Alliance defense fleet, Reikoku retreated, and only after the retreat did it take the time to officially declare war on the Phoenix Alliance. For a reason that will be stated later in the evening by our PR director, Reikoku sadly must choose to declare war on the Phoenix Alliance. Please take this as a fair warning, they say after the fact. What's up? Chipper, why are you crazy? I'll be right back. Something must be wrong. Real quick. That's right, cats will be cats. He was out of food, he's not having it. There we go. So the Phoenix Alliance hadn't yet committed itself to open warfare, but this sucker punch changed that. In the forums, people began overblowing the significance of the attack by calling it Pearl Harbor-esque. There was no stopping this war. Reikoku leaders Galavet and DB Preacher immediately approached Jade Constantine and Jericho Fraction to enlist their aid in the fight. Galavet and DB Preacher came to me and said, "Do you fancy a proper war?" said Jade Constantine in 2014. So I said, let's see it again. It's against Phoenix Alliance, revenge against the people who kicked us out and destroyed our deals and closed the borders? You fucking bet. Together, the two corporations form what they called the Northern Coalition of Allies, and the list of alliances fighting over the northern territories grew by one. By the next day, Reikoku had formed a new, even larger fleet with Jericho Fraction pilots and headed back into Vino. This time, Phoenix Alliance was waiting for them, with a veritable armada. Tiny interceptor fighter ships whizzed between hulking battleships to form the enormous Phoenix Alliance flotilla. The interceptors screamed through fights at incredible speed despite the fact they were often equipped with 4 huge cruise missiles. each of which was as large as the entire rest of the ship. An oversight that CCP Games eventually corrected. That looks so wonky. I remember that. The Mammoth Phoenix Alliance fleet reportedly outnumbered the Northern Coalition of Allies ships 10-1. The Phoenix Alliance fleet unloaded huge number of missiles and laser munitions on the attacking fleet, destroying it with ease. All the while, rank and file Phoenix Alliance members laughed and jeered at the enemy pilots, mocking them for thinking they ever had a chance against a dominant power in the north. Reikoku and Jericho Fraction were fine with the losses. They were here to make a statement. Jericho Fraction wasn't the only group that Reikoku had enlisted. 4 more were ready to pledge their support. Phoenix Alliance had absolutely no idea how big this war was about to become. Alright, chapter 6, and this will be the last one. The Great Northern War. The alliances of the North were sliding into an inescapable war. Over the next few weeks, every major faction in the North would be dragged into an all-out regional war for the first time in the history of EVE Online. Reikoku and Jericho Fraction alone would have been dead in the water with no hope of defeating the Phoenix Alliance's massive military-industrial complex. However, they managed to score a fantastic diplomatic victory and convinced Evolution, their old allies from the 2003 war in Vino, to come back to the north and resume their crusade to topple the northern powers. Evolution brought considerable organization and combat skill to this nascent alliance of northern rebels, and its arrival marked a turning point. The Northern Coalition of Allies, or NCA, was now a credible threat to Phoenix Alliance. The remaining powers in the north, NORAD, Fade Union, and Coalition of Declain, couldn't be contacted for this book, so it's difficult to know what their leaders' mindset were like during this time. Reports seem to indicate that they saw the fight against Phoenix Alliance as just, but were inclined to honor the Northern Alliance's security treaty and protect their ally. From the sidelines, they put the pressure on Phoenix Alliance to expel Cyberdyne in an effort to restore peace. It's important to remember that Coalition of Declain and Fade Union were close allies with Reikoku by this time. The trio of alliances fought together successfully for more than a month to remove Forsaken Empire from Tribute, and their pilots fondly remember their time at war together. It was going to take quite a bit for Phoenix Alliance to convince Fade Union and Coalition of Declain to go to war against Reikoku to uphold the Northern Alliance's security treaty. But Cyberdyne couldn't be reined in. After all the other incidents, a small skirmish occurred between Cyberdyne ships and a Fade Union Coalition of Declain fleet. It was a silly little fight that broke out after some Cyberdyne pilots fired off a few insults in the local chat channel directed at the Fade Union patrol fleet. It would have been almost meaningless at any other time, but with the drums of war banging, it was fatal to the treaty. Fade Union and Coalition of Declain considered all that had happened over the last 2 months and removed Phoenix Alliance from the Northern Alliance Security Treaty. Fade Union and Coalition of Declain joined the war, putting their sizable force behind Reikoku and the NCA instead. GP, easy. Yeah. Come here, I'll give you cuddles so you can stop crying. There you go. You listen to me now. On this matter, I speak for the Coalition of Declain and Fade Union. The Northern Alliance's security treaty was designed to ensure the security of 3 of the powers in the north, and to ensure the region of Pure, Blind, Tribute, and Veil to remain open and free to the public of EVE. Cyberdyne Industry, a Phoenix Alliance corporation, violated this treaty. Cyberdyne wrongdoing have been admitted by both Cyberdyne and by Phoenix Alliance as a whole. Phoenix Alliance was given 12 hours to remove Cyberdyne from NAST space. Declane and Fate cannot be allies with a rogue and immoral force such as Cyberdyne. As of this morning, Cyberdyne remains in the Phoenix Alliance. Coalition of Declane and Fate Union have voted to remove the Phoenix Alliance from the Northern Alliance Security Treaty. Spokesperson for the Coalition of Declane Fate Union, not fair, on May 31st, 2004. For their part, the leaders of the Phoenix Alliance were honorable about losing their allies. When Coalition of Declane laid out their reason for war against Phoenix Alliance, CEO Roby 1 replied, There were some good things that came out of our small time in NAST together. I met some good Coalition of Declane people, and if anything, it was a pleasure to meet some of you. Good luck. The sides were chosen, and the forces arrayed against the mighty Phoenix Alliance were many. Reikoku, Jericho Fraction, Evolution, Fade Union, Unicorn, and NORAD, as well as the Coalition of Declane, were now committed to removing Phoenix Alliance from its seat of power in the north. For simplicity's sake, the enemies of the Phoenix Alliance opt to collectively call themselves the Northern Coalition of Allies. They never formed an official alliance, but they were united by their common cause. The entire region had turned against Phoenix Alliance, but its power matched every other major forces in the north combined. The battle at PTAC F. The Northern Coalition of Allies pilot viewed themselves as liberators who were coming to aid the people of Phoenix Alliance. Its leaders saw the Phoenix Alliance Council as an irredeemably corrupt government that would rather put its civilians through a war rather than simply evict Cyberdyne. As the conflict heated up, Phoenix Alliance rallied its people and prepared for war. Phoenix Alliance coordinated its war assets and put ships into the hands of every capable pilot it had. In sheer numbers, it still had the advantage, and its leaders wanted to use those numbers to smother the opposition. Reikoku had already started the violence with its surprise attack days earlier on May 28. But the true beginning of the Great Northern War was fought at PTAC F, the gateway into Vino. Northern Coalition of Allies ships came up through Tribute, while Phoenix Alliance ships came down through Vino, and the two fleets gathered near a key mineral refinery in HTAC P. Both fleets were using scouts to report on enemy fleet movements. As the Northern Coalition of Allies force moves toward HTAC P, Phoenix Alliance cut them off and drew a line in the sand at PTAC F. As the ships continued to rendezvous in the system, the Phoenix Alliance fleet reached 150 ships. The Northern Coalition of Allies fleet reached 100. Both were impressive numbers for the time, but the Phoenix Alliance numerical advantage was on full display. There were not yet battle-hardened pilots. As both alliances arrived in the system, the fleet got into position, and then stayed still, waiting for the other to make the first move. Nobody in command of either of these enormous fleets would have understood how to win a fight like this. In this era of Eve, a large fleet fight usually meant 20 ships per side. This was many times larger than even the most seasoned fleet commander had likely ever seen. The Northern Coalition of Allies had deluded itself into thinking it could win a large engagement. Despite the 3-2 disadvantage, because its small skirmishes had gone quite well prior to this, Sarmoli, Jade Constantine, and Galavet, the main leaders of the Northern Coalition of Allies, doubted Phoenix Alliance's ability to coordinate a large group of pilots. The two fleets continued to stare at one another, each too afraid to begin the calamity. Finally, the Northern Coalition of Allies fleet brought its ships into engagement range of Phoenix Alliance. Both sides loosed cannons and unleashed a stream of missiles, railguns, laser munitions, the sheer number of which had never been seen before in New Eden. With nearly 300 people in the battle, the Eve servers strained under the weight of its enormous cataclysm, and strange things began to happen. Missiles disappeared out of thin air. Ships exploded seemingly without having been touched. Pilots were kicked offline without warning, then reappeared in a completely different part of the solar system in a completely different ship. Lag became the primary enemy of both fleets. The Northern Coalition of Allies had discovered that lag problems were reduced if their pilots turned their cameras away from the fight, which meant the servers had fewer things, particle effects, animation, and etc., to send to their computers. Using their instruments to engage the fight without looking, many coalition pilots conducted the entire battle with their backs turned. The initial part of the engagement was more or less evenly matched, and both sides took considerable losses. But things got much more complicated as the battle progressed. Fleet commanders' ships were steadily destroyed, which meant they could no longer conduct the battle. Each fleet had to adapt their lines of communications on the fly, and Phoenix Alliance was better at it. Its leaders kept their pilots focused on the highest value ship targets and kept a steady stream of reinforcement coming into the system. The Battle of PTAC-F was getting worse and worse for the Northern Coalition of Allies. Phoenix Alliance had managed to maneuver its fleet to sit between the Allies' fleet and the Stargate that led out of the star system. This trapped its pilots in the system, preventing any Northern Coalition of Allies reinforcement from entering. Northern Coalition of Allies commanders took drastic action by making the decision to rally all ships at the Stargate entry point of the system to shore up reinforcement lines. It turned out to be a catastrophically terrible decision. Lag in the system was bad enough that when the fleet moved position, many of them were unable to get a clear picture of the battle for minutes. In that time, the Phoenix Alliance fleet racked up countless kills against the suddenly defenseless Northern Coalition of Allies who were struck blind by the effects of lag. In EVE, it's not uncommon for lag to create unfavorable conditions for one or both sides of a battle, but that doesn't invalidate the result. In a game where the results of a game are irreversible, lag is roughly analogous to weather in the real world. Everybody knows there's a chance that could be rainstorm, and if your army isn't prepared for that, then you're a fool. Every decent fleet commander in EVE knows lag may be a problem, and a good battle plan will take that into account. The Northern Coalition of Allies ships retreated and scattered in all directions, falling back to deep space hiding spots within the systems. Phoenix Alliance propaganda and public relations officials had a field day with the slaughter of PTAC-F and confidently declared that the war would be over in days rather than weeks or months. It was hyperbole and they knew it. Phoenix Alliance wanted to seize on this victory and embarrass the Northern Coalition of Allies into submission. But while the propaganda officials picked on the losers, the leadership of one of Phoenix Alliance's biggest considered corporation, Rona, kept its decorum. On behalf of Rona, I as well salute the players who participated in this weekend's fight, said the Phoenix Alliance Roby 1 on the forums. Though we have a long way to go with this war, I was impressed at the sheer scope of support that Jericho Fraction, Reikoku and their allies have. Good friends are good to have. I look forward to engaging your corporations in the future. Then came battle plans. Phoenix Alliance wasn't resting on its laurels, though. Its leaders seized on their advantage and set up an offensive posture in the southern region of the north, where their enemies were located. The Phoenix Alliance pilots split up into wolf packs and prowled through tribute, fade, and decline, hunting for easy prey like miners or holding vessels. When Phoenix Alliance's squadrons ran out into much opposition, they'd fall back and form up in full fleet posture. With its full force, it was untouchable, and the Northern Coalition of Allies knew it. The NCA understood very quickly that this was a losing fight unless something changed. It couldn't win in a major fleet engagement, but it couldn't just play defense. This was supposed to be an invasion after all. To complicate matters, Phoenix Alliance had solidified its earlier partnership with Forsaken Empire, which was now sending ships to aid in Phoenix Alliance's defense. Forsaken Empire didn't have the spare forces to send fleets to help, but it hated the NCA enough to offer Phoenix Alliance whatever supplies it could spare. The NCA solution was as elaborate as it was effective. The disparate parts of the coalition broke apart into different tasks. Reikoku and Jericho Fraction were tasked with holding Pure Blind while conducting guerrilla-style raids into the heart of Phoenix Alliance's territory in Vino. The Coalition of Declain and Fate Union were to conduct strikes in Tenel. Black Nova Corporation, a lesser-known Northern NCA ally, was tasked with hunting down Phoenix. Traders and merchants in the Empire space just to cut off its financial arm. Meanwhile, Evolution managed to secure the space station BKG and base its operation there, attacking south from Branch into the heart of Vino. Because the NCA was made of so many tight-knit groups, it was easy for it to split apart into small but effective gangs, but engaging in small-scale battles in 5 to 6 different regions. The Northern Coalition of Allies had found a war it had a chance of winning. For a week, both alliances found comfort in their tactics. The Northern Coalition of Allies was able to strike and kill a few ships, but was eventually chased away by the mammoth Phoenix Alliance fleets. These cat-and-mouse tactics resulted in no decisive victories. During this stalemate, the politicians on both sides were working overtime as everyone attempted to rally the other major powers in New Eden to take their side in the war. The NCA scored a diplomatic victory Phoenix Alliance didn't see coming. Sormoli of Evolution reached out to a former friend who was a leader in a feared pirate corporation called Mu. Mu rarely got involved in inter-alliances affairs. Its pilots just liked to fight. But Sormoli convinced Mu to head north and direct its mischief toward the Phoenix Alliance. This was a problem for Reikoku's pilots, who had long considered themselves the enemies of pirates. Their anti-pirate reputation contributed in large part to the honorable image they enjoyed in the Greater Eve community. This war was too important to lose, however, and Reikoku needed help if it was going to bring it to a satisfactory conclusion. Its members sucked up their pride and publicly renounced their anti-piracy stance. If they were going to sacrifice their honor, then at least wanted to be honest about it. Reikoku was now in bed with two of the most hated entities in all Eve, the Pirates Masters of Mu and the Alliance Killers Evolution. It hurt Reikoku's public image, but it was a fearsome combination. The effects of Mu joining the fight were immediate. Phoenix Alliance suddenly had to contend with the best pilots and fleet tacticians the game had ever seen. Previously, Phoenix Alliance's massive numerical advantage trumped the slightly more experienced fleet commanders of Evolution. But now, Phoenix Alliance could no longer depend on their numbers to keep themselves. Mu was too good at breaking their fleets. Details of most battles are scarce, but we do know that almost immediately after Mu joined the fray, the NCA took the fight to the Phoenix Alliance in full. Even though Mu was only a few dozen members strong, its strategic brilliance had a huge impact on the outcome. Still fresh and confident from the massacre at PTAC-F, Phoenix Alliance wanted to engage in another large fleet fight. The details are lost, but we do know the Northern Coalition of Allies, alongside Mu, mopped the floor with its enemies. Starting in June 2004, the two sides in this war became averse to engage in more large fleet battles, except when it was absolutely necessary. Most major fights from this time included only around 20 to 40 ships per side, a far cry from the estimated 150 per side seen at PTAC-F. Both sides attacked each other with little more than raids, as both understood that the key to winning this war was to put the other on the defensive, to get inside their home turf, cut off their supply chains, and only then engage in a large fight. Otherwise, the ships would just be rebuilt. Phoenix Alliance began to fight smarter. It had no interest in meeting its opponents on the battlefield in fair combat. Phoenix Alliance saw its enemies as invaders, and its pilots weren't going to give them the fights they craved. Phoenix Alliance knew that boredom and frustration were its strongest weapon. When the NCA showed up to fight, Phoenix Alliance would disperse and hide. Its enemies would sneer at them on communications channels, but that only reinforced that Phoenix Alliance's strategy was working. Meanwhile, Phoenix Alliance sent some of its best small fleet pilots into Declane to cut off the industrial arm of Coalition of Declane by raiding them constantly. Without the ability to mine in its own territory or move materials around in haulers, the Coalition of Declane's production was greatly hindered. The Phoenix Alliance Corporation Rona and Romanian Renegades, a fully Romanian group, left their home system and started fighting behind enemy lines in the region of Declane full-time. Meanwhile, Phoenix Alliance's finest large fleet fighters were based in the northern branch. These players called themselves the Night Crew, under the leadership of Fleet Commander Presidio. They swooped in while the Europeans in the Northern Coalition of Allies were asleep to re-establish Phoenix Alliance dominance in branch. They piloted lightning-quick interceptor ships and forever crusaded to retake the station in BKG, affectionately known as the Burger King. BKG was the best staging location in branch because it was situated exactly in the middle of the region. All Stargate routes went through this system. There was almost no way to fly through the region without going through or very near it, so whoever controlled the station inside that system effectively controlled the entire region. A fleet in BKG could hit any system in the region within 15 to 20 minutes. Just as important, the system was only 4 jumps away from Vino and 5 jumps from Tanel. If an attacking force controlled the station in BKG, they could stockpile warships, organize a fleet, and be in Phoenix Alliance's territory just 20 minutes later. Once European prime time came around, Evolution was unstoppable and would easily take control of BKG. On the weekends, Presidio would often try to organize Phoenix Alliance fleets to move in and overtake Evolution when it was at its peak strength. By Presidio's own admission, he was never able to gain the respect of his pilot enough to organize a disciplined, large-scale fleet. It's a rare skill to be able to corral a dozen different groups of people who all have different ideas on how to fight, and Presidio never managed to gain enough clout to herd the cats into a coherent strategy. The Northern Phoenix Alliance fighters in branch were mostly holding their ground, even if they couldn't necessarily defeat Evolution. Elsewhere, Phoenix Alliance was having more success. It had previously sent Rona Corp and Romanian Renegades off to raid in the home system of Fade Union and Coalition of Declane, and word began trickling back that the operation was a huge success. Fade Union and Coalition of Declane were having a tough time defending themselves, and their industrial backbone was being torn apart. The raids against Coalition of Declane and Fade Union were so devastatingly successful for so long that eventually the two alliances started preparing to leave the war. Finally, Phoenix Alliance brought a full fleet to bear against the denizens of Fade and attacked at its home station of C4C. With its main fleet away, Fade's entire capital system was shut down for a full day. No pilot could fly, and it was unsafe to be undocked in any system in the region. The Phoenix Alliance fleet eventually left Fade, but the damage to Fade Union's psyche had been done. After the fight, Fade Union approached the rest of the NCA and asked for permission to leave the Alliance. Coalition of Declane followed suit shortly after. The organization was so badly beaten up that permission was granted for them to leave the war amicably. And then the birth of Bob. The coalition of alliance that made up the Northern Coalition of Allies was now a much different group than it was at the beginning of the war. The Coalition of Declane and Fade Union had mostly left the war, except for a few stray corporations that refused to leave the front. Reikoku was among those who refused to stop fighting. Its attack against Phoenix Alliance had sparked this war, and it was determined to see it through. After months of fighting, the only corporations left were dedicated to ousting Phoenix Alliance were those who were primarily interested in combat. The only non-combat focused corporation left in the NCA was Jade Constantine Roleplay and Trade Corporation, the Jericho Fraction. The Combat Corporation of the NCA found a bond in their common interest, and began to talk about forming an official alliance specifically designed to bring together their best combat pilots under one roof. With Evolution and Reikoku at their head, these corporations formed the alliance Cookies, Cake, Cream and Pie, or CCCP, a play on the names of EVE's developer CCP Games. The joke was that the alliance would take your cookies, your cake, and your cream and your pie, and leave you with nothing enjoyable in EVE. The name didn't last long, however, as CCP Game asked the group's leader to rename it out of fear that players might mistake a member of the CCCP Alliance for an official employee of CCP Games. The main leaders of the new alliance, Sir Molly and DB Preacher, switched the name to Band of Brothers, and continued the fight against Phoenix Alliance. Having fought in this war for months already, the members of Band of Brothers were now some of the most experienced combat pilots anywhere in the game. And the Alliance was instantly one of the most fearsome groups anywhere in New Eden. Sir Molly believed that the key to creating the most effective military force in the game was exclusion. Band of Brothers Corporation didn't accept random pilots into their midst. Players who wanted to join their alliance needed to be vouched for by respected peers and have a track record of excellence in combat. Sir Molly wanted to create an untouchable armada of elite pilots with no weak links in the chain. Some groups in EVE at the time were experimenting with the idea of safety in numbers, believing that if their fleet was large enough, then it wouldn't matter if their pilots were inexperienced. Sir Molly's Band of Brothers was designed more as a highly coordinated strike force, capable of fighting outnumbered. The alliance was governed by a council filled with well-known and capable leaders, but just as Evolution had, they united behind Sir Molly as the face of Band of Brothers. Phoenix Alliance had torn through the two of the allies challenging them, but the bulk of its enemies were still fighting. The members of the new alliance Band of Brothers continued to struggle to contract the regions of Venal, Branch, and Tino. Farther south, Jericho Fraction kept up the fight against Phoenix Alliance in Empire space, destroying their trade ships and ensuring Phoenix Alliance had no safe havens. While Phoenix Alliance was seemingly winning the war, it was slowly bleeding members, more and more. Phoenix was outfitting its miners and merchants for war. This was a problem because these sorts of players don't generally like to fight, preferring instead to mine and conduct trade. So when there was no safe place in the north for them to do that, they'd often fly back to Empire space to do their business in peace, and Jericho Fraction would show up to ruin their day. For these types of players, the only gameplay they enjoy in EVE Online was being stripped away from them in favor of a war they didn't ask for. Many found it's easier to simply leave Phoenix Alliance. All said Dern made up for the bleeding membership by securing yet another high-profile partnership. Far for the south, Dern had managed to convince Curse Alliance, which had some of the most skilled fighters in all of New Eden at this point, to head north and help Phoenix Alliance in the fight against Band of Brothers and Jericho Fraction. This is an official joint press release from the Phoenix Alliance and Curse Alliance. Let it be known, throughout the vastness of EVE, the Curse Alliance and the Phoenix Alliance will now support each other militarily against all common enemies. Foil, the co-leader of Curse Alliance, on July 7, 2004. It was a long way to travel for a fight, but the Curse Alliance made the hours-long trip north, arriving in pure blind. When scouts relayed word of the Curse Alliance fleet heading north, the main forces of Band of Brothers and Jericho Fractions got together to meet them. A combined fleet of Phoenix Alliance and Curse Alliance ships assaulted the region of Pure Blind, the staging ground for the Allied coalition, and clashed against a joint Jericho Fraction and Band of Brother fleets. The Curse Alliance ships brought with them a strategy that the Northerners had never seen before. Its fleet commanders used a ship strategy that they called the Cavalry Raven, and equipped them with large cruise missiles, dedicating most of the ship's power to speed. These Cavalry Ravens would launch a first salvo of missiles from a long distance away, then put on a burst of speed, catch up to the flight missiles, and salvo again. And they would fly right along the first salvo. They do this over and over until they were flying alongside 4 or 5 batches of cruise missiles that would all hit at the exact same time. The targeted enemy ship would instantly burst with no opportunity to repair itself. Curse Alliance's enemies usually had no idea what had just happened. By the time they knew they were being attacked, they were already floating in their escape pod. By July 7, 2004, 1.5 months since the beginning of hostilities, the world of Eve was beginning to wake up to the fact that this regional war had the potential to engulf the entire game. After Curse Alliance in the south joined the fight, the coalition of Free Stars in the far southwest hedged its bets and said that any attack on it in its territory would cause it to join the cause of Band of Brothers. Fountain Alliance in the west said much the same thing. If the territory of its allies, NORAD, came under attack in their region Outer Ring, then Fountain Alliance would join the war in full of the side of Band of Brothers. Rumors were circulating that Fountain Alliance was already secretly sending spare ships and supplies north to help its allies. Al-Kamzu, head of public relationship for the Fountain Alliance, said, "Fellow citizens, it is with growing concern we have seen the Northern War escalate as of late, both in terms of warring parties currently involved and the ever-increasing geographical spread of the hostilities. As I'm sure the good citizens of Eve are aware, the Fountain Alliance has a long history of fighting the savage barbarians of the Curse Alliance, and it is with their introduction into the war that we have now found it necessary to adjust our policy for our former strictly neutral stance to the conflict in North. The Fountain Alliance consider NORAD close allies and valued friends, and will use any means necessary to help keep the Outer Ring under the influence of a friendly government." The alliances of Eve were giving themselves an excuse to enter the war if they ever felt it was warranted. One false move could trigger a cascade of mutual defense agreement that would bring all of New Eden into a ruinous universal conflict. Curse Alliance had a great deal of enemies, and its continued involvement threatened to escalate the Great Northern War into what people were prophesizing at the time as Eve War 1. This would not have been a war Phoenix Alliance and Curse Alliance could win. For 2 weeks, Curse Alliance aided tremendously in helping Phoenix Alliance get off the defense and take the fight to Band of Brothers and Jericho Fraction. Curse's presence in the north began to trail off, though, as a simple consequence of the distance between its home base in the south and the main front of the war in the north. It was a pain for Curse to travel all the way to the north just for a fight. That's one possible explanation for it backing off. The other is that its leaders were worried at the fact that Band of Brothers had scored 2 new potential allies, Fountain Alliance and the Coalition of Free Stars, both with honorable reputation. If they continue to escalate this war, multiple new alliances could join the fight and put Phoenix Alliance and Curse Alliance at a severe disadvantage. After those first 2 weeks, Phoenix Alliance was on its own again. Curse Alliance went back to its home in the south. The leaders of New Eden breathed a collective sigh of relief. Even those already in the war didn't want it to spiral further out of fear it could drag on the conflict for an unknowable amount of time. Without Curse Alliance, Phoenix Alliance was left to fill its fleet with its own members, which got them back in the same problem it had been in earlier. Inexperienced combat pilots were never going to be able to take the field from the likes of Evolution and Mu, which had been a war since EVE Online was in beta. Reports from this time indicate that Phoenix Alliance lost several fleets due to inexperience. In one instance, Phoenix Alliance attempted to jump its fleet into battle, but the order to warp wasn't unanimous followed, and the fleet arrived in staggered numbers. 5 here, 15 there, 7 there, another 10 showed up a half a minute later. Rather than striking with a clenched fist, the fleet arrived one finger at a time, and Band of Brothers was more than happy to break them one by one. And then there was internal strife. As the war began to turn against Phoenix Alliance on the battlefield, Alset Dern also had to deal with problems on the home front. The entire war had been sparked after Reikoku accused Phoenix Alliance's renegade corporation Cyberdyne of unprovoked aggression. Alset Dern knew these accusations were true, but covered them up to keep the alliance together. The other leaders of the alliance believed Cyberdyne was innocent and were fighting to protect their ally. But months into the war, the secret had leaked out. People began to whisper about the rumors that Cyberdyne really was the guilty party and that Phoenix Alliance might be in the wrong in this war. Alset Dern struggled to keep control, keeping the secret under wraps. Moreover, Jade Constantine was spouting propaganda and misinformation constantly and had actually succeeded in distracting Phoenix Alliance. For months, Phoenix Alliance focus had been on capturing and holding the all-important station in BKG, but Jade had managed to goad its leaders into turning their eyes south to destroy Jericho Fraction in the region of Pure Blind. In an address on the forums, Alset Dern announced that his people were so fed up with Jade Constantine's verbal attacks that as a leader, Dern was forced to capitulate to the desire of his people and head south to focus on destroying her corporation. In the following quote, Dern uses the NCA to refer to their southern enemies, Jericho Fraction in particular, as opposed to Band of Brothers in the south. We would like to take this opportunity to hail the brave fighters of this conflict on both sides of the battlefield. The sheer volume of carnage unleashed has been staggering and left no star system north of Lone Trek unchallenged. For the Phoenix Alliance, it has been a war fought on many fronts with an estimated 71 hostile corporations against our 23. For nearly 3 months now, Phoenix Alliance's main fleet focus has been on the never-ending exchange of station control in the Branch region. It has been an epic conflict of numerous fleet battles, awesome firepower, and the destruction of billions in assets on both sides. Pushing EVE to its limits on a daily basis is enjoyable, and for this chance we are grateful. However, external conditions are now pulling our focus away from the north and demanding that we respond to the situation south of our home in Venal. A recent wave of foreign attacks on Phoenix Alliance policy is history, and its integrity have originated from the formidable PR offices of the leaders of the NCA. They have even had the gall to begin dictating the terms of our surrender. We find this kind of behavior inflammatory coming from those who have yet to wage war on. The growing voice for a military response for this audacity within the Phoenix Alliance is now loud enough to force us to focus on our attention south onto the forces of the NCA. That was Alset Dern, CEO of Oberon and Phoenix Alliance. When Dern made this decision, Phoenix Alliance finally lost its hold on the space station in Branch in BKG. The Burger King was under new management. After a month-long siege where Evolution, which was part of Band of Brothers now, and Phoenix Alliance continually attacked, conquered, defended, and lost that station, Evolution had finally secured a hold that Phoenix Alliance couldn't break. From its new stronghold at BKG, Evolution also captured a station at V7 TAC. It now controlled both of the main staging system in Branch and Tino. From those staging stations, Evolution could strike into the Venal region and carried out near constant raids into Phoenix Alliance's last stronghold. While conducting those raids, Evolution was doing more than just searching for ships to blow up. It was also carrying freighter full of munitions and ships. Evolution's combat ship would enter Venal, scare away Phoenix Alliance's pilots. Then once no enemies were around to see them, Evolution's supply freighters would dock within the station of 6NJ in Venal and offload their supplies inside without Phoenix Alliance ever knowing. Evolution was able to do this because there were two types of station in this era of EVE. Conquerable stations and stations owned by fictional factions. The station of 6NJ was the latter, and thus Band of Brothers could dock there freely and use it to store equipment. If it had been a conquerable station owned by Phoenix Alliance, Band of Brothers would not have been able to dock. After a few days of stockpiling munitions and spare ships at 6NJ, Band of Brothers sent out the call for the fleet to gather in the north and prepare to strike into Venal at a time of day when Phoenix Alliance had a large number of players online, allowing it to amass heavy resistance. Ships from every corporation still left fighting against the Phoenix Alliance, gathered in Branch before moving down as a united fleet into Venal. Phoenix Alliance scouts picked up on the enemy fleet movements and formed a defense fleet of their own. This force arrived at 6NJ with a formidable armada. Exact numbers from this battle could not be found, but estimates put the Phoenix Alliance fleet at around 100 ships against the 65 or so assembled by Band of Brothers and its allies. At this point in the war, fleet commanders knew what to expect in a large gate fight between hundreds of pilots, and there were a few surprises. The fleets engaged and each tried their best to target high-value enemies and control the effects of lag. As time went on, however, the Phoenix Alliance fleet commanders started to notice the Band of Brothers fleet wasn't losing numbers. Phoenix Alliance ships were dwindling, but Band of Brothers were not. The simple fact is that Band of Brothers were much more prepared for this fight than Phoenix Alliance, and it had chosen the battleground perfectly. The station in 6NJ, deep in Phoenix Alliance sovereign territory, was chock full of Band of Brothers replacement ships. Every time a Band of Brothers pilot lost a ship in the battle, the player would simply move their pod to the station, get into a new ship, and fly back to the battle within a few minutes. Phoenix Alliance's own stockpile was several systems away. Could take them 20 minutes or more to get a pile back into the fight. Band of Brothers had baited Phoenix Alliance into the battle by making its leaders believe they had a huge numerical advantage, but with Band of Brothers' practically endless ability to reinforce its lines, it quickly gained a grip on the battlefield. Band of Brothers had finally gotten the large-scale fleet fight it wanted, and it made it count. Its pilots broke the Phoenix Alliance fleet and took the field convincingly. They were able to push Phoenix Alliance back out of a system that was only a few jumps away from its capital system. The fate of all tyrants. With the war turning in their favor, Band of Brothers and Jericho Fraction made damn sure the entire EVE universe knew about it. Jade Constantine went into overdrive. Nearly every day there was a 500-word post on the forums from Jade taunting and demonizing Phoenix Alliance. In this era of EVE, the CAOD forum was the only major forum where all the Alliance leaders got together to make announcements and talk. That was the Corporation Alliance and Organization Discussion Board. Jade Constantine flooded CAOD with propaganda, and every political leader in EVE could hear her, including the Phoenix Alliance. Phoenix Alliance came to call it the Daily Jade. That's funny. Imagine having only one TV channel, said Co-Cheese, a Phoenix Alliance council member in 2014. You come home from work. You sit down in front of the TV after a hard day. You turn on the TV and there's a 5-minute commercial by Al-Qaeda telling you how much you suck. That's why it was like. Band of Brothers saw there was a benefit to this type of psychological warfare and got in on the action. It sent spies into Phoenix Alliance to start petty fights between corporation and clog communication lines. These spies would acquire login information for the forums of Phoenix Alliance Corporation, but rather than secretly hoard all of the information the spies collected from those forums, Sormoli of Evolution and DB Preacher of Reikoku instead opt to share it with their enemies. Sormoli and DB Preacher saw Phoenix Alliance as a weak amalgam of corporation that could be split apart. So they endeavored to create distrust between them. They'd share what the allies of Phoenix Alliance said about one another behind each other's backs. And every time they did, they'd remind their enemies of ways they could end the war and move on peacefully. Sormoli and DB Preacher had enacted a scorched earth policy. And if that meant destroying friendship in the Phoenix Alliance, then that was simply a casualty of war. Their most effective psychological tactic was implementing EVE's first kill board. The idea behind the kill board was to provide an objective, factual resource for showing the grunts in Phoenix Alliance that their team was losing. In any war, real or virtual, it's difficult for the frontline soldier to understand how the overall war is going. Even struggling armies tell their soldier that the war is going well simply as a tactic for keeping up morale. Wars in EVE Online are no different. Except now Band of Brothers had a factual way to publicly prove Phoenix Alliance's defeat. CCP Game had just implemented kill mails into the game. Players now got a piece of in-game mail whenever they shut down a ship, or were shut down themselves. That detailed the specifics of the encounter, what types of weapon did the most damage, which pilot got the final hit, and so on. Programmers within Band of Brothers created their own application that would take that information and automatically plug it into its website. Anyone who was curious could come and look at the latest casualties in the war. It allowed Evolution to keep the conversation focused on its specialty, combat, and forced Phoenix Alliance members to accept that they were losing the fight. Eventually, it did start to have an effect on morale in Phoenix Alliance, and participation in its fleet operation began to drop as players simply didn't show up, afraid of losing their ships. And then Phoenix Alliance fell apart overnight, almost without warning. Rona Corp, one of the largest members of Phoenix, left the Alliance. The secret that Cyberdyne Industries was actually the true first aggressor in this war had been discovered by Roby1, the leader of Rona. Unbeknownst to Band of Brothers, their enemy was crumbling from within. Roby1's sense of honor was so deeply offended when he found out he and his corporation had spent all of their spare time for months fighting based on a lie that he quit the war and left the Alliance as quickly as possible. Kochi, CEO of Rona, said that there was some dissension that sprung up, and several of the major corporations in the Phoenix Alliance left within a month's time, which then left the leadership void. The co-CEO of Rona, Acid Charm, she was angry because the war was still raging with Band of Brothers, yet Roby1 wanted to leave, and she felt like it was betrayal. You don't leave someone when they're down, you stay and fight, and when things are good, we can leave. Roby1 didn't want to, and he left. Mere days after Rona Corp packed its bags, Allset Stern's Oberon Incorporated followed suit. But before it did, it had one last matter to attend: evicting Cyberdyne Industries. The departure of Oberon was a huge shock to rank-and-file Phoenix Alliance members who had been hearing nothing but confidence from Alcedern prior to this. Alcedern basically said, "We're winning, we're winning, we're winning, we're leaving," said Cochise. You would say we were unstoppable, we were winning every fight. I remember every Jade propaganda post, there was another wall of text from Alcet contradicting it. The lie that Alcedern had endeavored to cover up to preserve the Phoenix Alliance was out, and it was quietly tearing Phoenix Alliance to pieces from the inside. The three main member corporations of the Alliance, Rona, Oberon, and Cyberdyne, were now gone, and with them went a huge portion of Phoenix Alliance's fighting strength. It came as a big surprise to all of us that Rona left, because Rona was the largest corporation, said Cochise. One of the top two corporations, I believe, at the time in EVE. They had a lot of ISK, and they had a lot of big ships, so it hurts us when they left. The Phoenix Alliance as an entity soldiered on, but it had just lost its strongest limbs. Not long after, Jericho Fraction and Band of Brothers actually arranged a security detail to escort Oberon and Rona out of the north, allowing their former enemies to safely and honorably evacuate their ships and other assets. But the war carried on without them. That's so cool. Jericho Fraction was content to call this an end to the war. It had achieved its goal of getting revenge against those who evicted Jericho Fraction pilots from the new Venal Alliance so many months ago. Rona, Cyberdyne, and Oberon. In an interview in 2014, Jade remarked to me that she felt Jericho Fraction had exhibited for the players of EVE the fate of all tyrants. And then was the reign of Cochise. It was fall in 2004 now, and there was a tremendous power vacuum to fill in the Phoenix Alliance. The three most powerful corporations in the Alliance were now gone, but the remaining 20 or so corporations were determined to keep the war going. The spark that ignited the Great Northern War and now burned out, but the hate that had kept the fire burning for 5 months was still there. For Phoenix Alliance pilots, this wasn't something that could be solved with a peace treaty. Band of Brothers was an invader, an interloper that didn't belong in the North and had come to kick Phoenix Alliance out and break their bond of friendship. The remaining corporation in Phoenix Alliance got together and held a meeting to figure out how to proceed. They had to decide how to fill the power vacuum in the Alliance left by the departure of their strongest corporation, and just as important, they needed to elect a new leader now that Alceth was gone. For an alliance against the ropes, spirits were remarkably high. Cochise, a low-level council member, and leader of the combat-focused Phoenix Alliance Corporation, the 20th Legion, was supposed to be at this meeting, but he was running late that Sunday afternoon. He rushed home from a family function, logged into TeamSpeak server, and heard nothing but raucous laughter. What's so funny?" he asked. "Well, I've got some good news for you, Cochise," a voice responded. "You've just been elected our new leader." 10 years later, Cochise told me that what was going through his mind when he found out he now had to lead thousands of people in a losing war. "I was scared to death," he told me. "I didn't know what to do. I remember shrugging my shoulders and looking out the window and saying, 'Okay, whatever, I'm going to do my best.'" That was the end of the meeting, and there I was trying to figure out what to do now. Cochise was taken off guard by the nomination to lead Phoenix Alliance, in part because he was so focused on the people in his own corporation. He cared about making 20th Legion as great as possible, and he didn't get involved in the larger corporation and alliance politics. Despite his disinterest in politics, he had slowly risen in prominence. He was seen as one of Phoenix Alliance's best fleet commander, a kind and well-liked voice in the Alliance Council, and a man who was diligent and willing to do the hard work. The Great Northern War had become something entirely different than it was when it began. Almost all of the main forces that started the war had moved on. Fade Union, Coalition of the Claim, Oberon, Cyberdyne, Rona, and Jericho Fraction had all either formally moved on from the fight or were rarely seen. Even Mu had decided to call it quits. Its leaders said they'd become annoyed by their fame in the EVE community and were tired of the effect it had on their gameplay. Specifically, there was more talking than fighting. The Great Northern War took a wholly different shape than before. On a much smaller scale, the war went on with Band of Brothers, Evolution, Reikoku, Black Nova Corporation, and battling 20th Legion, Gods, Blade Runners, North Star networks, which made the bedrock of the New Phoenix Alliance. The New Phoenix Alliance leaders felt very strongly that the loss of their major corporation was due largely to the non-stop propaganda attacks of Jade Constantine. Without Jade's propaganda, they reasoned Phoenix Alliance would have been able to weather the Cyberdyne controversy. The Phoenix Alliance Council didn't know at the time that it had elected the perfect person to lead them against this kind of verbal assault. I grew up in a family where my dad was a student of the very first positive mental thinkers in the 60s, Kochi said. He made a lifetime of being positive, a flow of positive energy. He was a minister, but he also did positive public speaking all over the country and was pretty good at it. He bombarded me all my life growing up with all the great sayings, you know, turn lemons into lemonade, all those things. Zig Ziglar, Tony Robbins. So I knew in my mind that I've got the tools that, if nothing else, I can turn their propaganda against them. Kochi set to work changing the attitude of his allies using everything he'd learned from his father to change the way they saw Jade Constantine propaganda. The negative propaganda had been tearing apart the Phoenix Alliance before this point, but now it became exactly the force that was holding it together. I was saying, guys, if there's not a reason to fight, then we pack up. We go back to Empire, said Cochise. These guys were insulting us. They were calling us every name in the book. They said we were dead. The brunt of my leadership meetings on Sundays were about that, encouraging our guys, building them up. It got to a point where they became my biggest asset. This wasn't a game for us, he continued. This was our home. They were our enemy. All appropriate emotions were applied. We hated them. Not in a virtual way. We hated them. It drove us. Man, I can remember blowing off work rather than leaving my guns in the fight. Cochise was able to right the sinking ship of the Phoenix Alliance and keep everyone's spirits up. The war began anew and the battles for the major holding points in the north, BKG and V7 TAC, were rekindled. The fighting was as impassioned as ever, but at a smaller scale. In real life, Cochise lived deep in the Georgian tract of the Appalachian Mountains. He speaks with a thick, friendly Southern American accent and has a playful way with the words. If there's an old American idiom that can sum up what he wants to say, then you can bet he'll use it. Cochise's Southern American charm is certainly part of why everyone in his alliance loved him and voted him to take the command. But it's also why he managed to maintain friendships with people at the other end of his gun barrel. Even as he hated the alliances that invaded his people's territory, he still had love for some of the people he fought. Cochise reached out to those people as the war dragged on. A large part of the reason for the constant propaganda attacks on the Phoenix Alliance was that Band of Brothers knew that it's exceedingly difficult to push someone out of their space in EVE by force of arms. You need to completely dominate them for that to work. The more effective path is to break their spirit. The Phoenix Alliance had been broken once before, but now it was psychically stabilized with their own Tony Robbins at the helm of the war effort. Cochise approached some of his friends across the battlefield in Band of Brothers and asked if a ceasefire could be negotiated. Band of Brothers asked if he was surrendering, and Cochise shot back, "Hell no, we're not surrendering, but I want to see if we can talk." A meeting was called, and the leadership of every major power remaining in the north got together to talk peace. It was the right time for a peace conference. Others from the Phoenix Alliance recalled being exhausted with the fighting by this point. Presidio, leader of Gods, one of the mainstay military corporations in the new Phoenix Alliance, recalled privately telling Cochise they were thinking of calling it quits. Evolution and Band of Brothers were growing wary of the fighting too. They talked, and Cochise was able to broker a ceasefire without giving up any territory to the invaders. The war ended by mutual consent, said Cochise. I went to that meeting, and the only criteria I had from my fellow leadership in the Phoenix Alliance was we will not surrender. We will not give up one piece of space. When the war ended, we were still the proper owners of the three regions, Venal, Tenal, and Branch. All parties agreed to the peace treaty, and the Great Northern War came to a close. Ask a dozen people who won the war, and you'll get a dozen different answers. Most people consider Band of Brothers the victor, because the war left them in a strong position, while Phoenix Alliance was greatly weakened. However, which alliance was considered victorious by their peers is less important than the war's ramification on the rest of EVE history. Fall of Kings. The Great Northern War is one of the defining moments in the history of EVE, because it shaped the structure of power in New Eden for years to come. Several of the strongest powers in the game were either destroyed or developed in the war. By the end, Phoenix Alliance was not the regional power it once was. The once promising Forsaken Empire had been beaten back into the east. Fade Union and Coalition of Decline were badly wounded and barely surviving. Mu had disbanded. Refugees from the similarly embattled southeast were coming in to settle in the weakened regions of Decline and Fade. But most importantly, Band of Brothers was forged and had proven itself capable of striking down one of the most powerful alliances in existence. Beyond that, it now had more experience with invasion tactics than any other entity in the game, and its experience in large-scale fleet fights was similarly unmatched. It had fashioned itself into a mobile military force that was capable of striking over vast distances, effectively dismantling the great powers of Nullsec. The Great Northern War taught Band of Brothers pilots to wage war on a scale nobody had yet seen. And they would soon use that capability to reshape all of New Eden. The first year of EVE Online, 2003, saw the rise of several formidable powers in the EVE universe. The next year saw the complete reshuffling of those established powers in the Great Northern War. The third year of EVE Online deals with a chaotic power vacuum that results from the removal of every established territory holding power in the game. When viewing maps from this time, a lot of new alliance names come from seemingly nowhere. Gone are the days when virtually the entirety of Nullsec was controlled by 6 entities: Phoenix, Fountain, Stain, Curse, Forsaken, and the Coalition of Free Stars. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Southern Territories. So far, this book has not discussed the Southern Territories very often, except in sidebars. The reason is because the South, while having a number of influential powers, more or less fell apart at this time. There's a clear dividing line in Southern history, and what happened before this time isn't strictly relevant to the years that follow. The 3 main powers of the South all independently split apart for different reasons. In the Southeast, Cursed Alliance splintered into several factions, and wars erupted nearly everywhere in its former territory. The second major power, Stain Alliance, entered its own civil war not long afterward. Finally, in the Southwest, the reigning power known as the Coalition of Free Stars was deposed quickly and easily by Fountain Alliance, a far more powerful neighbor on its northern border. The northern region didn't fare much better. The scattered remains of the north slowly collapsed. Refugees from the fall of the Curse Alliance arrived in the north to find a new home, and they evicted the existing northern powers to make room. In place of Fade Union rose G Alliance. In place of Coalition of Decline rose Iron. Phoenix Alliance collapsed not long after. However, the talent and manpower of these organizations lived on through other organizations. In a testament to his friendliness and diplomatic prowess, Cochise found himself and his corporation, the 20th Legion, as a member of Band of Brothers not long after the war ended. Though he would never again wield power on the scale that he did at the head of Phoenix Alliance in the Great Northern War, his ability to maintain friendships, and even with his enemies, makes Cochise one of the most talented leaders in the history of the game. State of the Star Cluster. Who controls which region at this time is less important than the overall effect. The unions between the first great Nullsec empires of New Eden had dissolved. The dynamic of power was shifting every day as more than a dozen would-be empires warred for dominance. Virtually every region in Nullsec was being fought over at all times, and if a region wasn't already being invaded, then an invasion was surely right around the corner. In the aftermath of the Great Northern War, Band of Brothers emerged as perhaps the single most powerful entity in New Eden, but it was an army without a mission. After the Great Northern War was settled, it went looking for a new goal for its hyper-mobile, war-fighting alliance. Next up on the chopping block, the Fountain Alliance in the West. And that will be for next week. I'll run those, I think, every Sunday. Every 2 weeks seems too spread apart. And I'm quite enjoying myself reading those out loud. I hope you guys are enjoying yourself just as much as I am reading this. And if you missed a part or you want to review it, the first video on Twitch does not work. But the second one, I think I fixed it. And so you should be able to come back to it. Also on the Eve Uni forum post for this class, there will be my own personal YouTube channel where I put those videos online. So you can have a look over there. And I hope you guys had a great time and see you next week.